The galaxy had known the House of Vera for thousands of years, and among its rulers, the most anticipated figure of the new age was the princess, who carried both the grace of her ancestors and the fierce spirit of a leader born under the twin sons of Valorous Prime. The day had finally arrived, when she would step into the Great Hall and choose the one who would stand beside her for the rest of her life, not only as a partner, but as a symbol of unity and strength for the Empire. This was no small tradition, for in the Empire of Vera, the bond of the royal heir was not a matter of romance alone, but a decision that could alter the political tides of entire star systems. The Council of Elders had prepared for months, summoning warriors from distant war moons, scholars from shining cities of crystal, and dignitaries from allied worlds. They came not only to witness but to compete for the most coveted bond in the Mon Galaxy. The Great Hall was carved from living stone older than any record, its vast ceiling holding the faint shimmer of stardust, trapped in crystal veins that glowed softly above the assembly. Along the sides of the hall, banners of alien houses swayed gently in the artificial breeze, while armored guards stood silent with weapons crossed. Among the towering figures of alien nobility stood a small group of humans, their presence more symbolic than practical, for humanity was young among the stars and had not yet risen to the political or military power of older civilizations. They were diplomats, observers, translators, the kind of people who attended great events not to participate, but to record and report them back to Earth. One of these humans was Daniel, a man who had been posted to Valorous Prime for 2 years, studying the customs of the Veran Empire and serving as a bridge for communication during trade negotiations. He had never sought attention and preferred the quiet work of drafting reports in his modest quarters, yet here he was, standing in a ceremonial robe provided by the hosts, dwarfed by the alien warriors beside him. Daniel was careful to remain at the edge of the hall, avoiding the center where the true candidates gathered in resplendent armor and shimmering garments made of rare silks woven in zero-gravity. The atmosphere was heavy with expectation. The alien houses had been preparing for this moment for years, training their sons and sometimes daughters to embody the ideal qualities of a royal mate: strength, beauty, cunning, and the ability to command fleets in times of war. Whispers filled the hall as the princess entered, her presence silencing even the most talkative nobles. She moved with the grace of someone who understood that every step she took was being judged, her robe flowing behind her like a river of molten silver, the jewels on her crown catching the light in 1,000 colors. Her gaze swept over the assembly with calm precision, noting each candidate without showing favoritism, yet there was a subtle sharpness in her eyes, as if she measured not only appearance but the weight of a soul. Daniel felt a strange stillness when her gaze passed over him, not because she lingered, she did not, but because for a heartbeat, he was reminded of their single meeting months ago at a peace summit. It had been nothing more than a polite exchange of greetings, yet he remembered how she had asked a simple question about Earth's oceans and listened as if his answer mattered in a room full of political theater. He had thought of her then as a ruler bound by duty, but curious about the lives beyond her empire. The emperor himself rose from the central dais, his deep voice echoing off the walls as he announced that the day of choice had come. His words were both ceremonial and binding. Once the princess pointed to her chosen, the bond would be recognized by all loyal houses and their allies. The nobles straightened in anticipation, each believing their candidate to be the most worthy, some already imagining the political power that would follow such a union. The princess began to walk slowly down the line of candidates, each bowing deeply or offering a brief declaration of loyalty as she passed. Some tried to display their strength with proud stances, others attempted charm with smiles and confident words. Daniel, not being a candidate, simply lowered his head respectfully when she drew near, keeping his eyes on the polished floor. The hum of whispered conversation followed her steps, growing louder as she moved closer to the end of the line where the human observers stood. The great hall seemed to hold its breath, and Daniel could feel the weight of centuries of tradition pressing against his quiet corner. He was certain the princess would finish her walk among the noble candidates and turn back toward the dais where the choice would be made. The thought of her even acknowledging him in this setting felt impossible, for humanity had no warriors who could match the alien champions, no ancient bloodlines to offer, and no political clout to bargain with. Yet something in the way she carried herself made him wonder if she saw the world through a different lens than the nobles who watched her every move. As she neared the final few candidates, the air in the hall seemed to thicken. The elders of the High Council leaned forward slightly, their expressions unreadable. The alien warriors tensed, some stealing glances at their rivals. The distant hum of the great crystal ceiling seemed louder in the silence. Daniel stood still, his mind drifting briefly to the endless ocean of stars beyond the hall, wondering how many times in history choices had been made in such rooms that changed the course of countless lives. He did not yet know that in a matter of moments, the princess's decision would shatter the expectations of every noble house present, ignite political storms across the empire, and place him at the center of a story that would be told for generations. The moment the emperor's words faded into the vast space of the great hall, the ceremonial music began to rise, soft at first but growing in strength like a tide pulling everyone toward a single inevitable point in time. The princess moved down the long central aisle, the shining floor reflecting her figure, as though she walked across the surface of a calm river. Around her the alien nobles stood in their finest armor or robes, each garment woven with the symbols of their house, some bright with golden threads, others deep and shadowed like the void between the stars. Many of them carried the marks of their victories and battle scars running along their faces, medals displayed on their chests, weapons decorated with jewels from conquered worlds. Every candidate's eyes followed her closely, and behind those eyes calculations were being made. Futures were being imagined. Alliances were being forged in thought before a word had even been spoken. The alien races gathered here represented centuries of history and unbroken power. And to them the princess's choice was as much about strategy as it was about tradition. To choose from among them, to strengthen the empire's hold over trade routes, to gain military support, to secure loyalty from powerful fleets stationed on distant planets. The murmurs among the council members carried hints of their own desires, for each elder had hopes for which house would rise in influence through this choice. Daniel stood near the far end of the hall, far enough to avoid the direct attention of the nobles, but close enough to witness every step she took. He told himself that this was simply another ceremonial display, one of many he had attended in the last 2 years, and that his role was only to observe and record for the Earth delegation. Yet the longer he watched the princess move among the candidates, the more he felt a strange tightening in his chest, as if the air itself was heavy with something unspoken. She stopped before a tall warrior from the House of Voron, whose armor glimmered like liquid steel under the hall's soft light. The warrior bent to one knee, speaking words that carried pride and certainty, promising loyalty to the throne and strength in battle. The princess listened without expression, offering a polite nod before moving on. Next came a scholar from the crystal cities of Ilvith, whose pale blue skin shimmered with faint patterns that changed as they spoke, their voice calm and melodic, as they promised wisdom and guidance for the empire's future. Again the princess listened, again she moved on, her steps never hurried, yet never hesitant. The audience watched her every gesture, some leaning forward slightly as though they could read her thoughts in the way her gaze lingered or passed quickly over a candidate. The air was thick with silent questions. Would she choose strength or intellect, tradition or risk, power or peace? Every noble assumed she would decide from among their own ranks, for no outsider had ever been chosen in living memory, and humans were considered the least likely to ever be considered. Daniel could feel the occasional glance of alien nobles passing over him and the other human observers, some tinged with mild amusement, others with open dismissal. To them he was not a rival but a curiosity, a representative of a young species still struggling to find its place among the stars. He kept his expression neutral, eyes focused on the ceremony, his mind wandering back to that single meeting at the Peace Summit months before when she had asked him about Earth's oceans. It had been an odd moment, for while others had boasted of their fleets and armies, she had wanted to hear about something as simple and vast as water, about the way sunlight turned waves into gold at sunset, about the sound of waves against a shore. He had spoken then without thinking of politics, and she had listened without the mask of royal distance. The line of candidates began to shorten as she moved steadily forward, and the tension in the hall seemed to grow heavier with each step. Elders shifted in their seats on the high platform, their robes rustling softly like distant whispers. The emperor remained still, but his gaze followed his daughter closely, weighing every move she made. The warriors at the edges of the room stood like statues, but even their eyes followed the princess, for they too understood that this decision would ripple through the empire for generations. The princess paused briefly before a young captain from the house of Karen, whose deep green eyes gleamed with ambition. He spoke boldly, promising to expand the empire's borders, to command fleets that would make the Varen name feared across the galaxy. His voice carried confidence, yet the princess's face revealed nothing, and after a measured moment, she moved past him as she had the others. The audience exchanged subtle glances, some relieved, others disappointed, but all waiting for the final choice. Daniel's pulse quickened as she drew closer to his end of the hall. He told himself that she would simply turn back toward the dais. Once she reached the final noble candidate, that her gaze might pass over him as it did before without meaning. Yet there was a quiet awareness building inside him, an unspoken question he could not push away. He could see her eyes moving from face to face, her steps unhurried yet deliberate, her presence commanding without force. When she passed the last noble candidate, she did not turn immediately toward the dais. Instead, she kept walking, her gaze lifting slightly as though searching for something beyond what the hall expected her to see. The nobles noticed, and the murmurs began again, low but filled with curiosity. Daniel kept his posture still, though he could feel the weight of her approach. The sound of her footsteps measured and steady. She looked at him for a fraction longer than courtesy required, her expression calm, but her eyes carrying a spark that made his breath catch. The music in the hall softened, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the crystal ceiling. Above, Daniel felt the gaze of dozens of alien nobles shift toward him, their expressions puzzled, some faintly amused. He had no idea why she had paused near his place in the line, and yet he could not shake the sense that something in this ceremony was about to take a turn none of them had imagined. He could not know that the choice she was about to make would not only challenge the traditions of the empire, but would set into motion events that would test the strength of worlds and reveal truths hidden beneath centuries of custom. The great hall seemed to hold the breath of every soul present as the princess paused in her steady walk, and for the first time since the ceremony began, the silence was not one of respectful attention, but of an almost trembling anticipation for something none of them could name. Her gaze moved slowly over the last few observers, as if measuring them against a standard only she understood. The nobles leaned forward in their seats, warriors straightened unconsciously, and members of the High Council exchanged curious glances as they realized she had walked beyond the final line of noble candidates. The music faltered for a heartbeat, before the attendants adjusted the rhythm to match her slower steps, and the echo of her movement on the shining floor filled the void. Daniel stood with his hands loosely at his sides, his mind still fixed on the idea that any moment now she would turn back and make her selection from among the powerful alien houses. He felt no fear and no particular hope, only the quiet certainty of an observer who was not part of the game being played. Yet when she stopped directly in front of him, the air around him seemed to thicken and the weight of dozens of eyes pressed upon him with invisible force. The princess looked at him, without the distant politeness she had shown to most of the others. There was recognition there, faint but undeniable, and something else, an appraisal that felt less like a judgment of his worth and more like an acknowledgement of a decision already made. Daniel felt an odd heat in his chest as her gaze held his, the faint shimmer of her silver robe catching the light and sending it dancing across the polished stone at their feet. The Emperor's voice broke the silence, not in command but in formal invitation, asking his daughter to name the one she would bind her life to. The words rolled through the hall with the force of law, and every noble there straightened to hear the name that would decide so many futures. The princess did not turn away from Daniel. Slowly, with the poise of someone who understood the gravity of the moment, she lifted her hand and extended a slender finger toward him. A sound moved through the hall like the first crack of a storm. Gasps, sharp intakes of breath, murmurs rising into open exclamations, the rustle of robes and the shifting of armored feet as alien nobles turned to stare in disbelief. The silence that followed was not the reverent stillness of ceremony, but the stunned absence of words when an expectation collapses. Daniel could only blink as her words reached him with clear precision. She named him not as a witness, not as a diplomat, but as her chosen mate under the law of the Varan Empire. His mind struggled to process the sound of his own name spoken in that voice, carrying with it the authority to bind worlds together. Outrage sparked among the nobles. A tall warrior from the House of Voran stepped forward, his voice edged with disbelief as he demanded to know if this was some kind of jest. A scholar from Ilvith muttered to her neighbor that humans were barely past the age of primitive warfare and had no place in the royal bloodline. A member of the High Council leaned toward the Emperor, whispering urgently, his expression tight with warning. The Emperor's eyes narrowed slightly as he regarded his daughter, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel as he asked her if she understood what she was doing. She met his gaze without flinching and answered that she understood perfectly, that her choice was made not out of whim, but out of conviction. She spoke of qualities that could not be measured by lineage or military strength, qualities she had seen in Daniel, who had no need to boast or parade himself, but whose words and actions carried the quiet courage of someone who stood where he was needed without demanding reward. The council chamber stirred with unease. For generations, the bond of the royal heir had been a calculated alliance, strengthening the empire's hold on power and securing the loyalty of influential houses. To choose a human was to append centuries of tradition and potentially weaken the empire's political foundation. The voices of dissent rose louder now, some demanding the choice be rejected, others warning of the insult this would cause to the noble houses whose candidates had been overlooked. Daniel felt the weight of their anger, though none of it had been directed at him personally until now. A few warriors glared at him openly, their eyes promising challenges should the choice stand. He wanted to speak, to protest that he had no part in this decision, but the formality of the ceremony and the shock holding the room in its grip kept him silent. The princess's voice cut through the rising noise with a clarity that demanded attention. She declared that the empire had grown strong in body and weapon, but weak in heart, that it was time for their people to remember that strength was not the only measure of greatness. She spoke of the value of perspective, of the need to see the galaxy not only through the eyes of those who had ruled it for centuries, but through the eyes of those who had come from outside its towering walls. Her words did not calm the nobles, but they silenced them long enough for the emperor to speak again. His expression revealed nothing as he announced that the choice of the heir could not be lightly dismissed, but neither could it be accepted without proof of its wisdom. Tradition demanded that a mate chosen from beyond the noble houses must face a trial to demonstrate worthiness, not a trial of mere physical combat, but a test of intellect, adaptability, and honor. If Daniel succeeded, the bond would stand. If he failed, the choice would be void and the princess would choose again. The announcement carried the weight of finality, and even those who opposed the choice could not argue against the law that bound them all. The murmurs subsided into a tense silence. Daniel felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted, carrying him toward a future he had never imagined. He met the princess's gaze, searching for any sign of doubt, but found only steady determination in her eyes. The hall began to empty as the council prepared to set the terms of the trial, the nobles withdrawing to plot and whisper among themselves. Yet even as they left, the shock of the moment lingered like the echo of a great bell struck in the stillness. What had begun as a ceremony of predictable tradition had become something else, entirely a challenge to the very foundation of the empire, set in motion by the single-pointed hand of a princess who had chosen the one no one expected. The great hall was no longer a place of ceremony, but a storm of quiet voices and concealed glances as the nobles dispersed into shadowed corridors and private chambers, each retreating to speak in hushed tones about the choice that had shaken the foundations of the empire. The council chamber beyond the dais became the heart of the empire's tension, its vast table surrounded by the elders whose authority was second only to the emperor himself. They sat in robes marked with the sigils of ancient houses, their faces carved by years of ruling, yet now sharpened by the weight of what they saw as a dangerous decision. The emperor entered with the measured step of a man who knew his every movement was observed and interpreted. The princess followed at a respectful distance, her head high, her silver robe whispering softly against the polished floor. Daniel came last, escorted by two guards whose expressions betrayed no feeling, yet whose presence reminded him that he was not free to wander. The weight of alien eyes on him was heavier here than in the hall, for these were not ceremonial stares but the cold calculations of rulers deciding the fate of an outsider in their midst. The discussion began without preamble. A counselor with deep crimson skin spoke first, his voice edged with restrained anger as he argued that the princess's choice insulted every noble house present and risked fracturing the alliances that had kept the empire stable for centuries. Another, an elder with a voice like dry leaves, claimed that humans were too short-lived to provide the continuity needed for royal bloodlines, that even if Daniel proved himself in the trial, his lifespan alone made him unfit for such a role. Others added their concerns, speaking of political unrest, whispers of rebellion among powerful houses, and the risk of appearing weak to rival empires. Through it all the princess listened without lowering her gaze, her hands resting lightly on the carved surface of the table, as though she stood not before her critics, but among equals. When the emperor finally turned to her and asked if she had anything to say in answer to the council's doubts, her voice was steady, carrying the same conviction she had shown in the hall. She spoke of the danger of choosing only from within the same narrow pool of power, of how insular thinking had led to stagnation in other empires that had risen and fallen before theirs. She argued that Daniel represented not weakness, but adaptability, a quality humans had used to survive and grow despite lacking the physical might of older species. She reminded them that diplomacy and perspective could hold an empire together as surely as fleets and armies. Daniel remained silent, knowing that his own words here could easily be twisted or dismissed. Yet as he listened, he felt the truth of her argument, even if he could not see how it would overcome the deeply rooted traditions that bound this council together. His mind wandered briefly to Earth, to the meetings he had attended in rooms far smaller but no less tense, where the fates of agreements had turned on the smallest gestures or phrases. Here the stakes were higher, yet the dynamics felt strangely familiar. The cautious glances, the weighing of each word, the unspoken calculations of advantage and loss. At last the emperor raised a hand, silencing the council. He declared that the law was clear. A choice made by the heir could stand if the chosen one passed the trial set by the council. The murmurs rose again, some voices calling for a trial of physical combat, others for a test of survival on one of the empire's harshest worlds. One counselor suggested a battle of strategy against the most skilled tacticians the empire could offer. In the end, they agreed on a test that would encompass all these elements, a series of challenges designed not to measure brute strength alone, but to reveal the resourcefulness, resolve, and wisdom of the candidate. When the terms were set, the princess glanced briefly at Daniel, and in her eyes he saw no hint of doubt, only the calm certainty of someone who believed in the outcome before it began. That look steadied him more than any words could have, though he felt the knot of tension tightening in his chest at the thought of what awaited him. The following days were a blur of preparation. Daniel was given access to limited training resources, though it was clear to him that some in the council had little interest in seeing him succeed. His quarters were moved to a secluded wing of the palace where he could be easily monitored, and his schedule filled with sessions in alien history, strategy, and survival techniques taught by instructors whose expressions ranged from neutral to openly skeptical. The princess visited him when she could, offering quiet encouragement and answering his questions about the customs he would face. Her presence brought him moments of calm amid the uncertainty, yet he could feel the weight of expectation pressing harder with each passing hour. Outside the palace walls, the news of the princess's choice had spread across the empire. On distant worlds, market stalls buzzed with gossip, taverns filled with heated debates, and in military barracks, soldiers argued over whether a human could truly stand beside the heir to the throne. Some saw it as a sign of the empire's openness, a bold move toward unity across species. Others saw it as an insult to their traditions, a weakness that would invite challenges from rival powers. Inside the palace, the tension coiled tighter. Daniel could hear whispers when he passed through certain corridors, and more than once he caught the glance of a noble who looked at him, as if measuring his worth against the memory of centuries-old victories. He kept his focus on the trial ahead, knowing that whatever opinions swirled around him would matter little if he failed the council's test. The evening before the trial, he stood on the balcony of his quarters, looking out over the city as the twin suns sank below the horizon, and the sky filled with the first glimmers of distant stars. The sounds of the palace faded behind him, leaving only the quiet hum of the city's energy flows and the distant calls of nightbirds that wheeled between the towering spires. He thought of the path that had brought him here, from the oceans of Earth to this alien capital, and of the choice the princess had made in front of the entire empire. Whether he understood her reasons fully or not, he knew he could not let that choice be remembered as a mistake. In another part of the palace, the council gathered in secret, speaking in low voices about the trial to come. Some hoped he would surprise them and pass, believing that such a victory might strengthen the empire in unexpected ways. Others were already preparing to see him fail, ready to push the princess toward a more politically acceptable choice. The fate of that decision now rested on the trials of the next day, and as the night deepened over the capital, the empire seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the human could rise to meet the challenge that had been set before him. The dawn of Valorous Prime was unlike any Daniel had ever known, for the first light of the twin suns spilled across the horizon in rivers of gold and pale silver, painting the towers of the city in colors that seemed to breathe as the sky shifted. From the balcony outside his quarters, he could see the great plaza, already alive with movement as the council assembled the trial grounds, their arrangements precise and ceremonial, yet edged with the unspoken hunger to see how the human would fare. The trial would take place within the arena of three paths, a vast circular space divided into sections that tested different strengths, one for the body, one for the mind, and one for the spirit, and each section watched by thousands in the stands, and by countless more through the Empire's communication networks. When Daniel stepped into the arena, he felt the weight of those eyes, though he forced himself to walk with measured calm the way he had seen the princess carry herself in the great hall. She was seated in the royal box beside the emperor, her silver robes glinting softly in the morning light, and though her face remained composed, he could sense her attention fixed on him, as if each of his steps mattered. The first path was a course of physical trials crafted to overwhelm even seasoned warriors, with towering walls to climb, shifting platforms suspended over chasms, and a gauntlet of mechanical beasts programmed to respond to speed and aggression. Daniel knew he could not match the raw power of the alien champions the council had trained for years, but he did not need to, for the rules only required that he complete the course, not that he defeat it in brute combat. He studied the movement of the machines, noting the rhythm in their steps and the hesitation between each strike, then used timing rather than strength to slip past them, saving his energy for the more demanding climbs ahead. Where others might have leapt to force their way over obstacles, he used leverage and angles to find paths that required less effort, but no less skill. By the time he reached the end of the first path, his breaths were deep but steady, and though a few in the stands still muttered doubts, there were others, now leaning forward with new interest, for the human had finished without injury and without waste. The second path tested the mind with puzzles built from alien mathematics and holographic war simulations that demanded quick thinking and strategic foresight. Daniel had spent years negotiating between cultures, learning to find solutions when languages and customs clashed, and now those same skills served him as he sifted through patterns in the holographic displays and found unconventional moves that confounded the simulated opponents. In one scenario where the obvious strategy would have led to a costly battle, he instead rerouted his fleet through an unguarded supply corridor, cutting off the enemy without a single direct confrontation. The counselors who had expected him to blunder through these tests exchanged glances, some grudgingly impressed, others unsettled by how he had adapted so quickly. The final path was the most unpredictable, for it tested what the Viren called the spirit, not in the sense of physical endurance, but in the measure of choice when faced with moral challenge. Daniel entered a chamber of shifting light where a voice spoke directly into his mind, presenting scenarios that forced him to choose between safety for himself and aid for others, between victory at great cost and compromise that preserved lives, between obeying orders without question and risking disobedience to protect the innocent. These were not puzzles with clean answers, but reflections of leadership in its most difficult form, and each decision left a weight in his chest, for he knew they were being judged not only by the council, but by the people watching across the empire. When the last vision faded, he stood once more in the open arena, the three paths behind him and the royal box ahead. The emperor rose slowly, his expression unreadable, and the murmur of the crowd softened into stillness. The council delivered their report in formal tones, stating that the human had completed all paths with competence and had demonstrated qualities of adaptability, intelligence, and moral judgment that could not be ignored. Those who had hoped for his failure could not dispute the results, and those who had supported him allowed themselves the faintest nods of satisfaction. The emperor turned to his daughter, and for a long moment said nothing, as if weighing the moment against the centuries of tradition it would alter. Then he declared before the assembly that the trial had been met, and that by the laws of the empire the choice of the heir would stand. The words rolled out across the arena, and the crowd erupted into a mixture of cheers, disbelief, and awed murmurs, the sound rising like a storm over the city. Daniel felt the tension that had held him for days finally loosen, though he knew the path ahead would not be easy. The princess descended from the royal box to stand beside him, her presence calm, yet unmistakably proud. She spoke quietly so that only he could hear, telling him that this was not the end of the challenge, but the beginning of what they would face together, and that she had chosen him not for what he had already done, but for what she believed they could do side by side. As they stood before the people of Velera's prime, the twin suns rising behind them, casting long shadows across the arena, the story of the human and the alien princess began to spread in earnest through the empire. On distant worlds, some still doubted, while others found hope in the idea that unity could be forged not only through power but through choice and trust. In the years to come, the image of that day would be etched into the history of the empire, a reminder that even in a galaxy bound by ancient traditions, a single act of unexpected courage could change the course of worlds. And so the ceremony that had begun as a matter of predictable custom ended as the first step into an uncertain future, where the human chosen by the princess stood, not as a symbol of weakness, but as a testament to the belief that sometimes the greatest strength comes from those the galaxy least expects. The end.